good morning and welcome to this special address by the Hon Peter Dutton MP, Leader of the Liberal Party of Australia and Leader of the Opposition. I'm Michael Fullilove, the Executive Director of the Lowy Institute. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which the Institute stands, the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders. Ladies and gentlemen, Australian voters will soon head to the polls to elect the new government. And the election will take place at a time when Australians are feeling less safe and more concerned about the world. In last year's Lowy Institute poll, only 62% of Australians said they felt safe when thinking about world events. That's down 30 points from the figure in 2010. And there are, of course, valid reasons for Australians to feel unsafe. Just look around the world. In the United States, we've seen profound shifts in policy since the re-election of President Trump. It's clear that the themes of Trump 1.0, his narrow definition of the US national interest, his scepticism of alliances, his hostility to free trade, will also animate Trump 2.0. Across the Atlantic, Europeans were shocked by the Oval Office struggle session between President Trump, Vice President Vance and President Zelensky. Some European states are proposing to deploy troops to Ukraine to monitor any ceasefire there. And Prime Minister Albanese has said that he's open to considering requests for Australia to contribute ADF personnel to this effort. It also seems that the Europeans are finally getting serious about providing for their own defence. The Middle East has been roiled by conflict since the murderous Hamas attack on Israel on October the 7th. And finally, as I wrote in the Financial Times last week, Australians watched that ugly Oval Office meeting in split screen. On one side of the screen, the US President bullied a wartime leader fighting for his country's survival. On the other side, a Chinese naval task group circumnavigated the Australian continent in a pointed display of power. So this is the world with which the next PM will grapple. It's a world that is much less benign than that faced by his predecessors. And yet to date, these momentous changes in the world don't seem to have filtered through completely to the Australian debate. Ladies and gentlemen, a little more than a year ago, Prime Minister Albanese set out his government's approach to the world when he delivered the Lowy lecture at the Sydney Town Hall. Today, we will hear from the man who would like to succeed him as Prime Minister, the Hon Peter Dutton MP. Mr Dutton is the federal member for Dickson, the Leader of the Liberal Party and the Leader of the Opposition. Since entering Parliament in 2001, he has served in a number of important ministerial portfolios, including as Assistant Treasurer, Minister for Health, Minister for Immigration and Border Protection, Minister for Home Affairs and Minister for Defence. I'm very pleased to welcome Mr Dutton to Bligh Street today to deliver this address, his major foreign policy speech as Opposition Leader. Mr Dutton, the lectern is yours.
Thank you. Well, Michael, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today, and thank you to you and to the staff of the Institute for the work that you do, for the contribution you make to the debate here in Australia. Can I say thank you very much to former Deputy Prime Minister of our country and very dear friend and colleague Michael McCormack, to my colleagues Dave Sharma, Julian Lisa and Jess Collins as well for being here. Ladies and gentlemen, to the Institute, to Stephen Lowy and to the amazing support the Lowy family provides to this Institute and to many other philanthropic causes in our country, and to the members of the board, thank you very much. It's a great honour to be here with you today. Many issues will take centre stage, of course, in relation to the next election. Among them, cost of living, the economy, housing, migration, health and energy. But the issues of diplomacy, of defence and indeed of national security will weigh heavily on the minds of Australians too. Australians know that we face a far more uncertain and dangerous world today than at any time in recent memory. The imperialistic Putin seems to be determined to swallow up Ukraine. The Iranian regime and its sponsored terrorist proxies, the Hamas, Hezbollah and the Houthi terrorist groups want to exterminate Israel, the only democracy in the Middle East, and the Chinese Communist Party is asserting itself militarily in our region and indeed across the world, often in aggressive ways, that have endangered our men and women in uniform. I understand that many Australians are unsettled by events abroad and implications.
Mr Dutton, why are you lying to the Australian people about the cost of nuclear?
I understand that many Australians are unsettled by events abroad and the implications for our nation's prosperity and security. In these precarious times, Australia needs strong, clear-sighted and values-driven leadership. And that's what I will provide if I'm given the great honour of leading our country. I want to be clear today about what a coalition government will do in relation to foreign policy and defence priorities. We're an exporting nation of only 27 million people. We produce more than we can consume. Our prosperity is contingent on several things: growing the productive things and parts of our economy, trading more, and having the regulatory environment at home which attracts foreign investment. All of these things require growing our trading relationships and nurturing our international relationships. And that's what a Dutton coalition government will do. Let's not forget that under the last coalition government, between 2013 and 2022, we finalised 11 free trade agreements. We lifted the share of Australia's trade covered by free trade agreements from 27% under the previous Labor government in 2013 to almost 80%. Under the Albanese government, only one free trade agreement has been finalised, that is with the UAE. I can announce today that one of our priorities will be taking forward a robust free trade agenda. We will reinvigorate negotiating a high-quality free trade agreement with the European Union that stalled under Labor. We will revitalise discussions on a free trade agreement with our trusted partner Israel, building on a strong economic relationship and looking to harness Israel's strengths in technology and R&D. We will seek to expand opportunities for trade and investment with Canada and other like-minded countries. And we will use our role as chair of the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership to shape the international trade system consistent with our national interests. I also want to make this point. The protection of the pharmaceutical benefits scheme has been paramount under all free trade agreements finalised by the coalition, and it will continue to be sacrosanct under any trade agreements negotiated by a Dutton coalition government. I want the Australian people to know that I will stand up and defend the PBS, which is the envy of the world, against any attempt to undermine its integrity, including by major pharmaceutical companies. We will work with our most important ally, the United States, but we will fight against any big drug company imposing tariffs on our PBS. The PBS, just like Medicare, is the fundamental basis of our healthcare system, and we're an ageing population. We have always supported, and we will always, into the future, support, strengthen and defend that system. Our foreign policy will be underpinned by moral clarity. I believe there is right and wrong and good and evil in the world, of course. In many ways, democracies have lost their resolve and their confidence because we've become susceptible to the false arguments of advocates, of keyboard warriors and conspiracy theorists who distort morality for political ends. A coalition government will always stand with our friends and our allies in their darkest hours when they face tyranny and terrorism. And if we don't stand with other democracies when their security, their sovereignty and their freedom is imperilled, who will stand with us when our freedom, our sovereignty and our security is imperilled? Of course, as a middle power, we cannot be everywhere in the world, and there must be limits to the support that we provide. We must make difficult but sensible choices, and there are tensions in our region which could escalate into conflict. First and foremost, a coalition government that I lead will prioritise the security of our country. Our focus must be doing what we can in our region, in concert with partners and allies, to deter aggression and to maintain peace through strength. To do that, we need much more investment in defence. We need to develop our defence capabilities at speed and scale so we can become a more credible partner to contribute to the objectives of deterrence and peace. Most importantly, we need to become a more self-reliant and resilient country. If we don't, Australia could be flat-footed in any uncertain time over the course of this century. And nowhere is this more important than in developing our sovereign defence capabilities, reindustrialising parts of our economy, and shoring up our energy security and fuel reserves. If our sovereign interests are threatened, Australia must never be in a position where we are totally relying on friendly cavalry to come over the hill. And sadly, that is the reality for our country today, and it must change, and it must change urgently. As for engagement with other leaders and governments, here too a coalition government will be led by what's in the best interests of our country. History has shown that acquiescence or appeasement ends in a cul-de-sac of strategic misfortune or worse. A government I lead will be fair and firm in its dealings with others. Our allies will not know a more reliable partner, nor our foes a more determined adversary. By prioritising the national interest, our government can make the hard, necessary and decisive decisions needed to defend our nation and keep Australians safe. The reason we've seen catastrophic failures in defence, diplomacy and national security under the government is that Anthony Albanese has not provided strong, clear-sighted and values-driven leadership. And there are many reasons for this. First, I believe it's his inexperience. Prior to becoming Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, after 26 years in Parliament, has never held a single national security or economic portfolio, and his experience in foreign affairs was limited, to be polite. The Prime Minister fails to grasp the interconnected nature of global issues and their implications for our country. Second, instead of prioritising the national interest in international policy, the Prime Minister has been driven by political expediency. All too often he views foreign policy through the lens of domestic opportunism. Because he has the wrong priorities, Anthony Albanese's decisions have rightly been defined by weakness. My contention is that the Prime Minister's inexperience, the opportunism and the weakness in the areas of defence, diplomacy and national security are undermining our national interest and endangering Australians. The government is the most left-wing since the Whitlam government of the 70s, and we are less safe because of it. Today, I want to illustrate this point by citing several incidents during this government's term while outlining what a coalition government will lead by way of difference. Let me start with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Ukrainians aren't just fighting for their freedom from Putin's imperialism. They're on the front line of the battle of civilisation itself. If a Russian flag is ever to fly in Kyiv, other autocrats would be emboldened to pursue their own imperialistic territorial conquests. If the Russian despot is successful in conquering Ukraine, he sets the example for others to follow that might makes right. And that's why Putin must be denied the victory he seeks. There is no equivalence, of course, between President Zelensky and President Putin. Zelensky is a democratically elected and inspirational wartime leader who is heroically leading his people in their fight for freedom. Whereas Putin, of course, is an unelected dictator who invaded Ukraine as a first step in his ambitions to restore the Imperial Russian Empire of old. And like others, I was deeply disappointed by the treatment of President Zelensky at the White House, and I've made that public before. But the Trump administration wants peace and an end to the conflict, and we share that objective. We all hope there can be a decent and lasting peace, no more so than the people of Ukraine. However, it will be an uneasy peace if Ukraine is not provided with robust and lasting security guarantees, given Putin's track record in breaking peace agreements. The question for Australia, of course, is what role should we play? Within 2 months of Russia's illegal invasion, the former coalition delivered a $285 million package of support to Ukraine. This included military equipment, including Bushmasters, armoured vehicles, as well as humanitarian aid. And it was a great honour to stand as Defence Minister at RAF Base Amberley with Ambassador Moroshenko to see off the first flight of Bushmasters to Ukraine. We sent thermal coal to help Ukrainians keep the power on, and we provided Ukrainians with visas for asylum. And we sanctioned more than 800 Russian individuals for their involvement and businesses for their support of the war. After the Albanese government came to power, we hoped similar support would follow on a bipartisan basis, but it refused to donate out-of-service Taipan helicopters, which they dismantled and instead buried. It ignored repeated requests from Ukraine for more thermal coal, and it hasn't delivered the M1 Abrams tanks that it promised. And while other countries reopened their embassies in Kyiv in a matter of months, the Albanese government kept the Australian embassy closed for almost 3 years. Now, such a blemished record is certainly no resounding roar of support for the people of Ukraine. So when the Prime Minister announced he will commit peacekeeping troops to Ukraine, everyone, including the Chief of the Defence Force and the Defence Minister, was caught by surprise. And we should see the decision for what it is, a desire to create the impression of strength to a domestic audience, rather than doing what is best and what is in our national interests. We need to be sensible. Of course, Australia should continue to provide military equipment, humanitarian aid, energy supplies and other support to Ukraine. But as for peacekeeping, or more likely war-ready troops on the ground, that must be a job for Europe and its more than 500 million population. It's also worth noting that no European nation, including Germany, France or Italy, have made a troop commitment in the way the inexperienced Anthony Albanese has done on our country's behalf. We're facing our own pressure with an ADF recruitment shortfall of 5,000 people. Australia can't afford the multi-billion-dollar sustainment price tag for having troops based in an ill-defined and endless European presence. It's money that we should be spending on the acquisition of guided weapons and other capabilities, and indeed on training our own people in joint exercises with the US, with Japan and with other allies in our region. Ladies and gentlemen, one of the Albanese government's most egregious foreign policy failures has been the treatment of Israel. Prior to the election, Labor promised that its support for Israel would be no different to that of the coalitions. But after coming to power, of course, Labor unilaterally and without consultation changed Australia's position on recognising West Jerusalem as Israel's capital. It then started referring to the West Bank and Gaza as occupied territories. And following Hamas's barbaric attack on Israel, the government should have sent a strong and clear message that it stood with our ally. Instead, the government's response was supine. We began to hear unreasonable calls for immediate restraint, calls for Israel to not look back in anger, calls for Israel to de-escalate and to pause its military response. Now, these calls persisted, despite hostages remaining in chains and being executed. These calls continued despite Hamas's odious terror network remaining active. And these calls endured while Hezbollah rained down thousands of rockets on Israel and while the Houthis and Iranian regime launched missile and drone attacks on Israel. All of this is revealing. Those making such calls, of course, hold Israel to a standard that they would never accept or expect of themselves in similar circumstances. There have been other illogical, ill-timed and inappropriate calls from the Albanese government, calls for Palestine's full UN membership, calls for unilateral recognition of a Palestinian state ahead of final state resolution, while Hamas continues to hold hostages and Israel remains under attack. Such calls advocate outcomes which, at this time, would be an endorsement of Hamas's use of terrorism to achieve political outcomes. Instead of treating Israel like the ally it is, this government has treated Israel like an adversary. And again, you need to ask yourself the question, why is this the case? It's because Labor has viewed our relationship with Israel through a domestic policy lens and with a view to its political imperatives. The government has adopted adversarial positions towards Israel to shore up Labor's votes in certain seats where there are undeniably anti-Israel and anti-Semitic views. In sidelining Israel, Labor has also threatened our interests. Israel has been a close friend that has shared critical intelligence with Australia, that has helped thwart terrorist attacks against members of the Australian Defence Force in the Middle East, and it has helped to save lives here on Australian soil. A Dutton coalition government will again put the national interest front and centre of our foreign policy. If I become Prime Minister, one of my first orders of business will be to call Prime Minister Netanyahu to build on the one-on-one meeting I had with him during my recent visit and to help rebuild the relationship Labor has trashed. Israel will be able to count on our support again in the United Nations. And again, UNRWA has employed terrorists from Hamas who participated in the 7 October attacks. The organisation will no longer receive $1 of funding from a government that I lead. I spoke at the outset of the need for Australia to grow our trading relationships. China remains a significant and incredibly important trading partner. We naturally seek a stabilised and respectful relationship with China, and a healthy trading relationship which benefits our two peoples. I've said before that I want to see the relationship grow, the trading opportunities expand between our two peoples. And Australia has a remarkable Chinese diaspora, something of which we're all incredibly proud. Chinese migrants have made Australia their home, embraced our values, become citizens, contributed to our nation in many fields of endeavour, and raised a new generation of Australians who cherish our country. Many Australians of Chinese ancestry maintain connections to family in China, and so a healthy bilateral relationship is in China and Australia's mutual interests. But time and again, the government has failed to call out the Chinese Communist Party's military aggression against men and women of the Australian Defence Force. Silence in the face of such unacceptable aggression saw the government put their domestic political interests ahead of the national interests. Self-censorship is a price no self-respecting country should ever pay, especially a democracy like ours. Now, Australia must be willing to criticise any nation whose behaviour imperils stability in the region. And that's what a coalition government I lead will do confidently and in concert with our like-minded countries. We also won't tolerate foreign interference which targets Australians of Chinese ancestry, or any Australian for that matter. The government I lead will jealously guard the rights and freedoms of Australians like Kevin Yam and Ted Huey. Red lines need to be made clear, especially in a period of tension. Because if they're not, we end up with a situation like the one in recent weeks. A situation where the Chinese Navy provided no notice of its live-fire exercise whilst it circumnavigated Australia. A situation where our national maritime surveillance was outsourced to a Virgin airline pilot. Now, this unacceptable incident is a failure of diplomacy and defence at the highest levels. Australia has an abiding interest in ensuring our resilience, our security and sovereignty, not just for our country, but for our region. The Coalition's Pacific Step Up was about deepening partnerships grounded in shared values. And we're pleased to see the Albanese government carry forward the Pacific Step Up. The Coalition delivered a record $1.85 billion of aid into the Pacific in the last budget in 2022 and ensured Australia was the largest aid donor in the Pacific. Indeed, we delivered some $750 million more than in the previous Labor government's last budget in 2013. We created Australian Infrastructure Financing Facility for the Pacific, and our $2 billion Pacific Maritime Security Program delivered 14 of the 21 Guardian-class patrol boats, upgraded wharf infrastructure and supported aerial surveillance. The Coalition has always sought a bipartisan approach for Australia's engagement with the Pacific. But in the lead up to the 2022 election, Anthony Albanese and Penny Wong made the Pacific a partisan issue for their own domestic political purposes. And their ongoing domestic politicisation of Pacific diplomacy and smears against the former coalition government have been exploited by other nations. Contestability in the Indo-Pacific has been intensifying for some time amidst an unprecedented military build-up by the Chinese Communist Party, and competition has only increased in the last 3 years. The number of security and economic agreements between China and Pacific Island nations has increased, and yet agreements Australia has sought to make have yet to be finalised. Under a coalition government, I want Australia to again be the clear and natural partner of choice for Pacific nations, for our family. We will redouble efforts to build an understanding of the mutual benefits of Pacific nations partnering with Australia. And while respecting the sovereign choices of every Pacific nation, we will spare no effort in articulating the risks posed in other agreements that undermine our shared interests for an open, prosperous and sovereign region. Ladies and gentlemen, of course, Australia's national interests do not always align perfectly with the interests of our partners, even our closest allies. In 2018, the first Trump administration sought to apply tariffs on aluminium and steel imports from other nations, including Australia. A concerted effort from Australian political leaders and diplomats secured Australia's exemption in 2018 and preserved the exemption again in 2019 against a backlash from Washington. On both occasions, Australia's Prime Minister and ministers engaged directly with President Trump and their counterparts robustly and directly, and we unapologetically defended Australia's interests. The exemption was based on our historic alliance, our modern relationship and the economic facts of Australia having a long-running trade surplus with the US. As for the second Trump administration tariffs, let me be very clear. We disagree with President Trump's decision to apply these tariffs. They're not just unjustified, they benefit neither Australia or the United States, and we will continue to offer the Albanese government bipartisan support for the removal of these tariffs and exemption from future tariffs, because that is in Australia's best interests. But let me tell you what's holding back Australia's national interest. A Prime Minister who is unable to get a phone call with the US President to discuss the tariffs or indeed other pressing matters, and a Foreign Minister who finds out about the tariffs not from the US government or indeed her counterpart, but from the media at the same time as the rest of Australia. Australia is paying the price for Labor's ill-disciplined and disparaging remarks against President Trump, and they didn't believe that he was ever going to win the election, which undermined their standing right from the very start. I will always prioritise Australia's interests if I am Prime Minister of this country. And here's the important point. The US and Australia's pursuit of national interests is not mutually exclusive, and it's not an impediment to doing more together. The United States is still and must always be our most important partner. And we are an important partner to the United States. The question Australians should ask themselves is this: who is better placed to manage the US relationship and engage with President Trump? I've worked successfully with the Obama administration, the Trump administration Mark I, and the Biden administration. The clearest example of my ability to work with foreign leaders on any matter of any political persuasion is evidenced through the negotiations around the AUKUS defence partnership. AUKUS represents the first time that the US has shared its nuclear propulsion technology with a foreign country since the 1950s. And I do believe that if there's a change of government, I will be able to work with the Trump administration Mark II to get better outcomes for Australians. We worked with President Biden, even though he'd spent much of his career opposed to nuclear proliferation and wasn't instinctively in favour of the AUKUS deal. But we were able to work with our political supporters in Washington to achieve an historic outcome for our country, and we can do it again. I will seek to meet President Trump in Washington in the early days of a Dutton coalition government. I will talk to him about how our national interests are our mutual interests. And there is much that we have in common to take forward: deregulation, civil nuclear power, and most importantly, defence, and AUKUS, not just Pillar 1, but Pillar 2 as well. The Trump administration has said that burden sharing is an important part of being in a shared alliance, and the best place for Australia to share the burden with the United States is in the Indo-Pacific, in the theatre of mutual interest. As I said, by developing our defence capabilities, we do two things. We become a more credible partner to contribute to the objectives of deterrence and to maintain peace in our region. And we become more self-reliant and resilient in defending our national interests. To develop our defence capabilities, we need to invest much more in defence. When the coalition came to power in 2013, defence spending under Labor was at 1.56% of GDP, the lowest levels since 1938. We lifted it beyond 2% of GDP, but under the Albanese government, defence spending as a percent of GDP has hardly shifted. Labor rightly describes these times as the most precarious since the end of the Second World War. But their actions don't back up their warnings. The defence legacy of the Albanese government is not a good one. More than $80 billion in cuts and delays, extended and multiple reviews, capability hold-ups, and the cannibalisation of programs to pay for others. Unbelievably, late last year, our Navy was left with just one operational Collins-class submarine. And in recent days, we've learnt that the Collins-class life of type extension is in jeopardy. And whilst I acknowledge the Albanese government's support for AUKUS, frankly, the evidence indicates over the last 3 years that their heart isn't in the game when it comes to defence. Under Penny Wong's influence, Labor has adopted the naive position that selective diplomacy can always solve the day. The Dutton coalition will make a significant investment in defence, including by reprioritising Canberra-centric funding. We've already committed an additional $3 billion to reinstate the 4th Squadron of F-35 Joint Strike Fighters, which had been cancelled by Labor. Ukraine has shown that a smaller military can inflict significant damage against a larger adversary with the right asymmetric capabilities and tactics. I want to see our domestic defence industry given the confidence and investment to develop small and cheap capabilities quickly and in bulk. A modern defence force needs missiles, it needs drones, uncrewed undersea vessels and small surface vessels armed to the teeth. Importantly, AUKUS is the linchpin to create a seamless defence production partnership with the United States, leveraging our combined industrial strengths. We need to do nothing short of rethinking defence, of retooling the ADF and re-energising our domestic defence industry. And that's exactly what our government will do. Ladies and gentlemen, in uncertain and dangerous times, the difference between prosperity and hardship, and between security and a very difficult time, it all comes down to leadership. In foreign and defence policies, Australia needs strong leadership, not weak leadership. Clear-sighted leadership, not morally confused leadership. Values-driven leadership, not leadership driven by political expediency. A Dutton coalition government will provide the strong, clear-sighted and values-driven leadership that our nation desperately needs. It'll be underpinned by prioritising the best interests for Australia. My true belief, my honest belief, is that we live in the best country in the world. We live in an uncertain century. And the time now is for us to take seriously the threats, the unknowns, and to provide support to defence industry, to every asset we have at our disposal, including the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, our international relationships, and to leverage that to the maximum benefit for every Australian. And that's the commitment that we make in this election to the Australian people. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, Mr Dutton, thank you for those remarks, which I think were very helpful because they were very clear. And well done also for keeping your cool when a couple of people with media IDs tried unsuccessfully to disrupt an important conversation. So
we live in a great democracy.
Indeed. And in that democratic spirit, thank you for agreeing to take some questions. Let me kick off with this. If you're elected Prime Minister, which country would you visit for your first overseas trip, and why do you think that relationship is so important?
Well, it's a very good question. The United States, as I said in my speech, remains our most important military partner, and there is a lot of repair work to do in that relationship. I believe that is a priority for us, and I think the opportunity would present quickly to travel to the United States. There would be an opportunity to meet with other world leaders as part of that trip. I think the relationship with Indonesia remains sacrosanct, and our relationship with Japan and indeed with the UAE is underdone. I've expressed my interest in visiting China and working with our friends in Beijing to our mutual interest and pay respect to that important trading relationship, as I pointed out before. So I think there are a number of competing priorities, but my sense would be that at this time, in our national interests, the United States would be a very early first visit.
All right, good. Let's come to the United States. You said there's repair work to do in the relationship. You said you'd seek an early meeting. In fact, your first overseas trip as Prime Minister would be to Washington. How would you try to manage Mr Trump at a personal level? Because it's not always easy. Let me give you a couple of models. We've seen somebody like Mark Carney, the newly elected Prime Minister of Canada, who's pushed back quite forcefully against Trump, who visited London and Paris before he went to Washington. On the other side, we've had President Duda in Poland, who's dusted off a proposal to establish a US military base called Fort Trump in Poland. And then somewhere in the middle, you've got someone like Keir Starmer, who's trying to balance the hard and the soft. So you've said you're in a better position to manage Mr Trump than Anthony Albanese. How would you do that?
Well, I think in politics, and I've been in Parliament for a long time now, I think the best indicator is past performance, and I have had a consistency in the way that I've approached relationships with world leaders and with individuals with whom I've formed personal relationships, or people that we've kept in contact with from previous administrations in the US and the UK and elsewhere. And it's the theme through all of that has been respect. We were able to work with the Trump administration in relation to calling out some of the big media companies in relation to child exploitation and the inability of a company like Facebook to provide information to the police where pedophile networks were sending images and videos of children being sexually assaulted between their networks. I worked very closely with Ivanka Trump and with Bill Barr and others in the 45th presidency. We worked, as I said, very closely with the Biden administration. The thought of having a Virginia class based in our region, or more frequently in our region, or indeed the nuclear secrets being shared with Australia, was not something that previous governments had contemplated. And yet we were able to achieve that. And there were many discussions that I had with counterparts, including the Secretary of Defence and others, the Secretary of Navy and Nuclear Navy in the United States. And it took a lot of work to achieve that. But there was a process of engagement and respect. And so we need to bring respect to the relationship. But President Trump's been elected to put America first. My job is to put Australia first. And I will stand up firmly against President Trump or anyone else in our country's best interests. And I do believe, as I said earlier, that there are great areas of mutual interest and benefit to a productive relationship. And I think we can achieve that in a way that the government hasn't been able to achieve. The ambassador seems to be persona non grata. The Prime Minister can't get a phone call or a visit to Washington. And that doesn't bode well for whatever is coming next. As I said, I don't believe the government had anticipated the prospect of the election of President Trump. Well, surely Ambassador Rudd would have deleted tweets before President Trump was elected. There would have been a greater nurturing of the relationship and likely appointees to the administration. All of these things that we were contemplating, people that we've worked with before or that we've known, either in the West Wing now or still within institutes or within business or within departments, people who have points of influence within the administration. And I think the government has squandered that opportunity, which has been to our national detriment. And my objective would be to work in a respectful way to drive the outcomes that are important to Australia and to our region, and to stand up and to argue our corner very forcefully.
All right, you mentioned AUKUS. Let me ask you a couple of questions about that. First of all, just at a basic level, why do you think it's important for Australia to be able to operate a fleet of nuclear-powered submarines? What would their mission be?
Well, the great thing about the Australian people is that sometimes we pretend that we're not a tiny island nation of only 27 million people in the middle of nowhere. And if we think that we can go it alone over the course of a very uncertain century, then I think that is a perilous contemplation. And I believe very strongly that we have had 3 lost years and we've missed the opportunity to try and really capitalise on the AUKUS agreement, which was historic. Pillar 2 in relation to space, in relation to AI, in relation to autonomous vehicles, etc., that piece has largely sat on the shelf. And AUKUS is faltering because the money is being cannibalised through from the other 3 services, and that has created a culture of discontent within the Australian Defence Force, particularly Army, and within Australian defence industry, where people are seeing their own contracts cancelled or pushed to the right to try and fund some of the commitments that the government's made under AUKUS. So we do need a greater investment. Why do we need the capability? Again, because we're an island nation, isolated. And the beauty of the nuclear submarine is that it provides a stealth capability, and it is the best technology in the world, and it provides a replacement of a capable Collin-class diesel-electric boat that won't be fit for service in the 2040s or beyond that period. And the projection, the ability with technology to be able to deploy undersea capability from the submarine and for further reach, obviously collection and interoperability with the United States and the United Kingdom, given the attack class there, all of that is absolutely paramount to our national security interests, and that's what we embodied in the AUKUS agreement.
All right, on AUKUS, there's a lot of talk at the moment, including from your predecessor as Liberal leader, Malcolm Turnbull, that we need a plan B if AUKUS falls over. Do you think we need a plan B, or are you confident we'll be able to achieve the plan A?
I'm confident that we can achieve Plan A, and it's a national project that must be successful. And the Prime Minister, as I say, on the one hand, and I support him in his statement when he says, and the Deputy Prime Minister, Richard Marles, the Defence Minister, says this regularly as well, that we live in the most precarious period since the end of the Second World War. Now, if that statement is to mean something, or if it's to be explained, it can't be explained by taking money out of defence or deferring investment and delaying capability acquisition and providing a deterrence that our country must project. It's anomalous, and it hasn't yet been explained by the Prime Minister. What does he mean by that statement? It's based on intelligence. It's consistent with what the Brits are saying, with what the Canadians are saying, with what the Europeans are saying. Listen to Jens Stoltenberg's words in relation to this issue. There is a deep and consistent theme of concern about what happens in this century. And the Prime Minister says that, reflects that in his statement, but it's not reflected in the investment decisions or in the budget papers or indeed in the direction that the government's given to defence.
All right, let me ask you about defence spending, because you clearly signalled an intention to increase defence spending, but I don't think I heard a number unless I switched off at that moment. And we do like to make news at the Institute, Peter. Can I tempt you to suggest a number? There was a report in the AFR this week that indicated the coalition is closing on a target of 2.5% by 2029.
Well, you can tempt me, but I won't take the temptation. We'll make an announcement in relation to defence at the appropriate time, but I think we've signalled very clearly that you can't say that we live in the most precarious period since the Second World War. You can't sign up to AUKUS with the very significant financial undertaking that is that program and not put additional money into the Australian Defence Force. So we'll have more to say in that regard, but there is a clear demand for it, and we're committed to increasing defence spending, and we've been very clear about that.
And what would be your priorities for that extra spend? Would it be on recruitment? Would it be on drones? Would it be strengthening missile defences in the north?
Well, it's all of that. So it's on human capability, and it's on defence materiel, and it's also about how we're leveraging the opportunities here in Australia. I think, again, you can look to the international example, but what's happened in Japan in terms of their ability to provide sustainment and servicing to the United States Navy, there is enormous opportunity for us domestically, whether it's in Osborne or Henderson or on the East Coast somewhere else, for us to provide that support to a fleet, whether it's the US, the UK, Japan, other countries who will have a greater presence in our region, that would create jobs and create economic activity and would leverage strength. When we were discussing AUKUS, in my mind, I always wanted to make sure that we were a net contributor to the overall output, the overall industrial capacity output, so to contribute to increasing the drumbeat of the Virginia class or the attack class out of Barrow. And that was, I think, lost on this government, and I think there is some recalibration of that. We need to spend money efficiently, and there's a lot of inefficiency in the acquisition process at the moment. It's far too bureaucratic. It's far too costly. The timelines are pushed out deliberately to the right to try and move money beyond the forward estimates, and we need to address some of those institutional problems within defence as well to drive that productivity and to drive an efficiency. And there are some fantastic examples where defence has done well in different programs, GHOSTBAT and others, where we've worked with industry, and we're talking to defence industry at the moment who are closing their doors. And that is not something that should be a feature. We should be providing further support and sustainment to them, and as I say, in turn, the opportunities will come with our allies to provide support to those, defence forces as well.
All right, let me ask you a couple of questions about China. What message was Xi Jinping sending when he deployed that naval task group to go right around the continent and conduct those live fire exercises without appropriate notice?
I listened to your words earlier, and I concur with your judgment that it was a show of force. Now, they're not words that the Prime Minister used at all. It was the weakest, most limp wrist response you could see from a leader. And frankly, none of his leaders, Liberal or Labor, would have provided the response that the Prime Minister did. So it was an obvious sign of force. It was contempt because the Papua New Guinean government had been provided with pre-warning where the Australian government hadn't about the movements, and it shows also a critical failure in our response capacities, or whether the government directed that there was no response. There were surface assets that were deployed, but again, there was no urgency to that task. And I think what was being tested was our response time, how we would engage, what we would say, and I think the Prime Minister, frankly, has failed every one of those tests.
All right, how would you square the circle, though, on the relationship with China? Because it's not easy to push back against an authoritarian superpower even while you're trying to engage with it. And you've criticised, just now, you've criticised Mr Albanese quite forthrightly for not being, for not standing up for Australia enough in recent weeks. But on the other hand, I've seen that you've said that the relationship with China will be much stronger if you're elected. How do you square this circle of being tougher with China but having a stronger relationship?
Because I don't believe that President Xi, with the strength of his leadership, respects a weak and incompetent Australian Prime Minister. And I believe that our relationship is best enhanced where we can have a respectful relationship, and that is achieved if we're able to speak frankly about our points of differences and engage vigorously on our points of mutual interest. I do want to see the trading relationship prosper and expand, but I'm not going to pretend that we just had a circumnavigation of our country which has significant consequences for our own outlook on the region and what that means for our national security interests.
All right, you mentioned the Pacific. You're proud of what the coalition government did in the Pacific. For most Pacific Island leaders, climate change is a key priority. What's your message to capitals in the region about how Australia would work with Pacific Island nations to deal with climate change?
Well, again, I think the past performance is the best indicator of future practice, and we worked very closely on the issue of climate change. We worked very closely over the course of COVID to deliver vaccines and support. The administering, Michael McCormack, has been central to much of our work when we were in government, and has a fantastic relationship with many leaders and significant figures across the Pacific. And we can continue to provide support to programs and support Pacific partners. And there are many priorities that they have that we can assist with. And that's exactly what we did in government through additional financial support. And we'll continue to provide support into the future. And that, I think, is a commitment to our Pacific partners about the importance that we place on the relationship.
On Ukraine, briefly, let me just push you a little bit on your remarks. You said that the job of policing, managing any ceasefire is a job for European nations, not Australia. But if we believe what we say, that aggression against China is damaging the rules-based order, don't we have a responsibility to defend it? That is, if we're a beneficiary of the liberal order, sometimes we have to serve in its bodyguard, don't we?
Well, yes, that's true. And as I said before, we're a middle power, and we don't have the ability to have a presence in multiple theatres. That much is obvious, and that will always be the case for a population of our size with a GDP and welfare system and other demands on public expenditure. So it's ill-defined. Europeans haven't yet made commitments or undertakings that are firm, and there is no peace. And I think the Prime Minister wanted to project strength and to look strong by making the statement, and then thought about what he'd offered up. And Richard Marles and Pat Conroy tried to walk it back in the 48 hours after the Prime Minister had made that statement. But he's doubled down on it, and I don't believe that we should be out ahead of where the Europeans are in relation to a border presence with Russia, where there is no United States assurance about providing an overlay or providing an extremist response. And in the Middle East or in other conflicts that we've been in, it has had the presence of allies, generally including the United States and the United Kingdom and Canada and Five Eyes partners and others as well. in this instance, that's not the case. The United States has said that they won't have a presence. And I think that is a fraught decision by the Prime Minister. And I strongly believe in providing additional support to Ukraine. And again, we demonstrated that from the very first day of the horrible invasion. And we will provide support, in my judgment, for a long time into the future, including the rebuild of Ukraine. I think we should be providing support to see them thrive as a democracy in the region. But the thought that we're going to send troops from our shores at a time when the Prime Minister says in our region it's the most precarious period since the Second World War, we're underdone as it is. And the billions of dollars, as I point out, of sustainment are better spent and directed into training and acquisition of capability.
All right, I want to take a couple of questions from the audience. Peter Harcher has caught my attention. Peter.
Thanks, gentlemen. Thank you, Peter.
Is that you waving a placard before, Peter, or not?
I didn't think you'd notice it under my jacket, actually. I was keeping it for the end. But you're right to question my media credentials. Many do. You talked about the coalition's past performance in the Pacific Step Up, and your future hopes for the Pacific. The US has just shut down the US aid program, including to the Pacific, which will close off US projects in the Pacific, creating a vacuum for Chinese friends to step in and supply that good. Should Australia now step up further its aid support to the Pacific to fill that void? And if a Dutton government were to do that, would you do that by increasing the overall aid budget or by cutting aid elsewhere?
Well, you've established your media credentials immediately with that last part of the question, which is actually what you were building to. But I'll put it in the same category as Michael's very insightful question earlier, which is asking a policy that we haven't yet released in relation to figures around aid. But one of the things that upset the Indonesians was that they didn't get an early phone call from President Biden. And Prabowo, I think is obviously running a different country now than his predecessor. But there was an aggravation in relation to that, a simple example. And it demonstrated to me, and we communicated this to the Americans at the time, that there needed to be greater respect and engagement in the Indo-Pacific and a timely response to requests and an engagement in programs and delivery of priorities for some of those nations. And I think the most important element that we could bring to the table, and I hope the government's doing this now, is identifying individual programs that have been cut and advocating for them to be stood up again, and for the Americans to re-engage, because it's not just about the money or the program of whatever nature. And the Americans ultimately, it's their money and it's American taxpayers who are funding it, and the government's been elected and they'll make decisions that they believe is in their country's best interest, as we do, and we each respect that. But I think there is a place for Australia to advocate for some of that funding to return, and we can do that in a respectful way with the United States, but I don't agree with some of the funding that they've withdrawn, and I think it is detrimental to the collective interests in the region, and I hope that there can be a discussion between our governments about a sensible pathway forward in that regard.
Sarah Ferguson from the ABC. Sarah, if you just wait for a microphone.
Thank you for the speech, Mr Dutton.
Thanks, Sarah.
Is there any impact that the US could serve on Australia in relation to tariffs that would make you reconsider the vast contributions that we're making to the American defence industrial base to achieve AUKUS?
My job is to act in our country's best interests. What is in our country's best interests in the short, medium and long term is a strong military relationship underpinned by ANZUS and most recently endorsed through AUKUS. And it brings together like-minded countries, not just the United States, and that would be my focus in the relationship, to do whatever we can to enhance that military-to-military training exercise or procurement or whatever element of the relationship that we might be talking about, and I think that is important. So if we can find that common ground, then I think that is a very productive discussion.
Richard McGregor from the Lowy Institute at the back. Richard?
Yes, in relation to the Chinese task force, are you concerned about the fact they were there? Is there in fact an issue of principle there, or is it simply about articulating our concerns about it or our objections to it?
Well, you can answer that question if you're looking at it in isolation and you say, well, it was a one-off event, it was a communication error and it was inadvertent and we wouldn't expect that that would happen again. But it comes off the back of what we've seen in the air and what we've seen in the East China Sea and South China Sea as well, and it should cause concern because it shows a pattern of conduct. And it's not a respectful approach that's been taken to our country. And as I said before, what's important is that we have a frank but respectful conversation and relationship between our two countries. And I've heard the ambassador use those exact or very similar words. And it's a combination of all of that. It's the latest in a sequence of events. It's escalating. The Chief of the Defence Force and the Chief of Air Force have spoken about the precarious circumstances. So if we saw a C-17 fall to the ground or we saw some catastrophic event where Australian Defence Force personnel lost their lives, Australians would rightly be outraged, and it would not be an acceptable event by any stretch of the imagination. And so I think we would look back on these events and say, well, it was sort of predictable in a sense that there had been a lead up and an escalation in each of these previous events and nothing had been said or no pushback or no red lines and no conversation. And that's why I think it was appropriate for the Prime Minister to make a strong statement, but he just didn't rise to the occasion.
Mr Dutton, I'm going to take the last question, and I want to put a question to you that I also asked to Mr Albanese when we hosted him before the last election. You've been in Parliament a long time. You've seen all of our recent Prime Ministers up close. From a foreign policy perspective, who among those PMs have you admired? Is there a foreign policy Prime Minister you'd like to emulate if you're elected Prime Minister?
Well, the heaviest influence on me in my political life has been John Howard, and I came into Parliament in 2001, so I saw 6 years of his Prime Ministership, but had watched him very closely in opposition and in government before he came to power in 1996. So that would be my instinctive response. I think there was a natural instinct from Kevin Rudd in relation to foreign affairs matters, obviously. He could have been, he was robust in some of the language he used at different points, as we recall, but I think he had a genuine engagement and a capacity to be respected in those discussions. And I think, I can look at my own predecessors, Tony Abbott's response to the loss of life at the hands of Russia, of innocent Australians just going on holiday. And so there are points in time, but I think the short answer to your question is probably John Howard's relationship with Indonesia in particular, the response to the tsunami, the way in which that was instinctive, our response in East Timor and the liberation and support there, I think were two of the most substantive moments in foreign affairs that served our country's interests and our friends' interests, and I think that was, they were proud moments for our country, so I think I would cite those.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're out of time. It's been interesting and action-packed. Mr Dutton, I'd like to thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank you for paying us the compliment of giving a substantive speech and answering a lot of questions. So thank you very much for coming. And ladies and gentlemen, please thank the opposition leader.
Thank you very much.